नहीं 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 मुझे नहीं आता क्या कान में can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. If you can't, raise your hands, okay? I'm going to say things I want you to hear. Okay? So don't feel shy. Let me know, please. Compared to my host here, Dr. Fareed, I'm somewhat of an old lady. So I think it's better that I sit and talk, even though I do lectures all the time. But this way I'll be more relaxed. It'll be like we are just chatting with each other. And I hope that that's the environment we will establish. I'm going to get some water from here. May I just have a little bit of one water? So I don't pass out and faint in the heat. I'll open. Okay. I'm again, for those of you who are joining or those who were already here in the morning, once again, I am honored and delighted to be back in the classroom with my favorite people, which are the students and some faculty. Um, what I'm going to do in this opening day, for 1 hour, and I know some of you will want to fall off to sleep, but I'm going to make sure I keep you awake. We'll talk a little bit about the theoretical cons- uh, uh, things behind diaspora, okay? Since the topic for the day is women and their diasporic experiences, I thought that the first day, no matter how sort of boring and theoretical the material is, what it does is establish the framework within which all the 5 days of discussion can take place. And I absolutely assure you that after the first day, when I'm also a little more rested up, we are going to have fun. Even though I'm going to work very hard with you, I have, based on my various books, one of them deals with Africans in India, which is diaspora of Africans in India. Another one deals with Indians in East and South Africa. A third one deals with uh, dying to be white, the obsession for fair skin in India and the global South. And there too, this yearning, this great desire amongst diasporic people, whether they are from India or from the Caribbean or from Africa or from Pakistan or from Bangladesh, the desire is to be more like the white women. And I have never understood it, but it is a part of the diasporic experience too. And the last one, I believe, and we keep on changing the ordering, so it might be, is one of the books that I enjoyed so much working on was on women in the stepwells of Gujarat and Rajasthan. And that's the book that seems to have caught the fancy of a lot of people. Focus was only on women. Men were sort of peripheral, on the margins of the discussion of mine. And so, but what is interesting about that is that I may have spent 10 years going from one step well to another, and it wasn't because I'm a student of history and archaeology. Just a minute. Oh, so what do I need to do? Now you can hear me? Okay, let me know, okay? Don't, so and what fascinated me, and I'm going to make a very strong case to say that you should allow your minds to let go of the of the notion that diaspora is simply moving from India to US or to UK or to the Gulf states or to Canada or to Australia. Diaspora can involve and entails often moving from the village to the city. It involves the movement from rural to urban. It has all the same constraints, all the same pain, all the nostalgia, the longing for home that women who go to England might feel, or to Australia. So I would like us to first and foremost not think of diaspora or diasporic experiences as being only limited to people who go to foreign countries. Okay? Think about diaspora in a much broader context. Okay? If you move from the village, leaving behind everything that you are familiar with, your girlfriends, your parents, the religious places that you went to, the food that you enjoyed, and you move in with your husband to a new town. The loneliness, the alienation, the displacement, the dislocation that they feel is really the same that people feel when they move to another country. So this expands our definition of diaspora, and that I very much want, because I would like to think that there are sitting amongst you some students at least, even if they are 2 or 3 or 4, who will be inspired to move on, not just attend a 5-day workshop or a 4-day workshop, but move on to seriously study the field of diaspora as you proceed with your academic career. It is absolutely filled with excitement, and there is a potential for wonderful scholarship. I'm only discovering, if I lived 120 years, I'd do a lot of work on diaspora. But now I have to depend upon your generation to do that, and it's very, very exciting. So, and you know, the songs that women sing in this new environment, the stories that they share with other women, the complaints that they may have about their husbands and their treatment in the new environment, all of those are very similar experiences. Okay? When you people get married, some of you will know that in fact it is a diasporic experience of dislocation, alienation, loneliness, displacement, extreme nostalgia. And it takes, there is some grief in it. There is some pain in it. But I also don't want you to sit there thinking we are going to cry over this. Because I'm an example, I hope, of somebody from a diasporic experience as well as marriage in the US. And what I felt was empowerment. I wasn't going to allow either a foreign country or a husband or my own career to make me feel anything else other than what I wanted to be and become. And I'm hoping that some of that will be what you will pick up from this experience. Okay, just a little bit. Okay, so having said that, I'm going to, are you able to hear easily? Are you able to understand my English? Remember, I'm a diasporic woman. I'm trying, I have to tell you this. When I started teaching, and I had a 40-year teaching career before I retired in 2014 to do some writing. The first few years that I taught American students, and they were all American students, I could see the way they were shifting in their chairs. And I could see the way they were, talking to each other while I was talking, that they were a little uncomfortable with my English. And I told them, I said, are you able to understand? Because I had just gone from India. I had been teaching Indian students. And I said, all I wanted you to know, you don't have to say yes, you don't have to say no. I am not going to change my accent at all. You have to get used to me, and we will get used to each other. And this is the way it is. When I come to India, I have to say that to the students, that I will speak slowly. I will try to speak in with clarity, but this is a diasporic person. I live in two cultures. I have a hybrid identity, and I'm proud of both of those, and I flourish with both of those. Okay, let's talk a little bit about generalities. Um, the word, and some of you are already familiar with this, but I want to set the stage for a broad sort of understanding of diaspora so that in the next few days are filled with um, knowledge, but also fun and joy and learning in ways that it will be exciting. You know, otherwise, I consider myself a failed teacher. So, which I'm not. You know, I'm very happy always to be teaching, to be in the classroom. It is delightful to be with some of you today. Okay, the word diaspora originates from a Greek word, okay, coming from the two letters dia, which, and spero, S-P-E-I-R-O, which means scattered. So diaspora uh, word itself refers to people who are scattered. Does that make sense? Uh, in Greek, it means to disperse, to scatter, to spread out, and that's exactly what happens in diaspora. It's a translation also of a Hebrew word. So originally, when studies, scholarship, academic work was done on the subject of diaspora, essentially the understanding was that when we talked about diaspora and diasporic experiences, we are really referring, or we were referring, to the scattering or the dispersal of Greeks, Jews, the Jewish people from Palestine, their home in Palestine, and Armenians from Armenia. Okay? So these three people were the subject of diasporic studies: the Jewish people, the Greeks before that, who spread all over in the Mediterranean world in the centuries before the Christian era, and of course the Armenians. It simply really means the movement of people from one place to another place. And I started talking about that at the beginning. Let's expand our definition of diaspora, and their shift in residence. It refers, of course, to migration and sometimes to colonization. So early migrations are a part of diaspora. As I said, early Hebrew, it meant, initially referred to the setting up of colonies by Jews outside of Palestine after the Babylonian exile. If you want to change, let's write, because everything falls under identity, culture, heritage, under a larger umbrella of diaspora. Okay? So don't hesitate to tell me, stop me, and we can shift it. And I'll keep a lookout for that. The early studies on diaspora or the diasporic experiences essentially dealt with migrant workers, what was, and oftentimes what we call, and these are important terms in diasporic literature, what we call involuntary migrants. Okay? Is the word easy enough and to understand? These are migrants who have moved not because they wanted to, but they are not voluntary, they are involuntary. They are moving out of economic necessity. They are moving as a result of indentured labor. They are moving in even earlier societies, worse still, more painful still, as slaves, for example, from the African continent to the whole new world. So the population in US, for example, is really comprising of people who belong to this involuntary diaspora of Africans from their homeland, snatched away from their families, from their homes, from their land, from that what was familiar, to the Americas, to the Caribbean, to the countries, but mainly to the Americas and to the Caribbean. And their history is very fascinating, but it's only a small part of that diasporic history. But it is the involuntary migrations of people during the colonial times and even before that, during the period of slavery. Okay? The more recent diaspora, the second kind, is voluntary. So voluntary diaspora is one in which one goes of one's free accord. So when I went to the United States in I hate to tell you this because then you'll know how old I am. You'll calculate very quickly. But anyway, when I went to the US in 1968, I went totally as a voluntary migrant, okay? And unlike a lot of other women who migrate because they are joining their husbands or because they are married and moving there, my migration was not only voluntary, it was individual. So it was a different kind of migration, and I'm going to spend a whole lecture unraveling my soul. I've not done that in so many years. Not even with my American students have I shared the deepest emotions of mine as somebody who left India to go to another country alone to study. But it was a completely, nobody forced me. I wasn't married. If marriage came, it came voluntarily of my choice when I was there. And we can talk about it. I'm not shy about discussing this. That's the truth, you know. That's the way it is. So that we are talking about two different types, voluntary and involuntary. Both of them are very, very different. Okay, so what happens when people go migrate to voluntarily or involuntarily to another land, to another place, to another city, to another town, to another environment? Are there things that we see that are generally common to all of these diasporic people? And I'm going to touch upon, because there are technical terms in diasporic literature, touch upon, try to define for you all of them, and then we'll see examples of it in the next 3 days. So we will be talking. Okay, one of the first things that happens when you are a part of a diaspora is that you live between two worlds. Okay? The home country, and when I say the home country, it is the country where you were born and brought up, where your parents were, or your families are, your village, your community, your friends, everything that you grew up. Okay? So one world is the home country. The other world, the other home that you will go to in a diaspora is the host country. Host, home versus the host, H-O-S-T. For me, for example, home country was India, as it always will be till I die. And the host country, much as I love it and have had a very good experience, will be the United States. So we are always talking of these two sometimes conflicting homes. One is the home country, the other is the host country. There are all kinds of experiences that one encounters in this move. The first one for most migrants, whether they are voluntary or involuntary, when you find yourself in a new environment, there is a acute sense. I don't know how to describe it. I mean, 60 years later, I can shut my eyes and remember what it was like to be in America, that I'd gone on my own volition. Remembering my sister, remembering my parents, remembering my home in Ahmedabad, remembering my girlfriends in Delhi, remembering my university, remembering the people I left behind. So what one normally experiences, the degrees are different, the intensity is different, but what one nearly always experiences as a diasporic person is a sense of dislocation. Okay, so this is a very important word in diasporic literature. You relocate to a new place, say, in my case, a new country, and in the process of relocating, you feel dislocated because you've left everything you loved behind. There can be a lot of loneliness in that. Okay? There can be a lot of anguish in that. But even more, I don't feel the loneliness. You know, my parents are no longer alive. Everything seems to have gone, the things I grew up with. But what remains is another word that you need to be familiar with in your understanding of diaspora, and that's nostalgia. Okay? Nostalgia. Now, what is nostalgia? It's not nostalgia grows out of loneliness, but out of much more. Even when you're not lonely, you are nostalgic for what you left behind. You can never go back. In some ways, what you go back to, and you say, well, how do you say you can't go back? You could have picked up, if you felt nostalgia for India, for Delhi, where I grew up, you could have picked up and you were independent, you had got your education, you could have come right back to India. But what you come back to is never the same. Okay? In diasporic literature, they call it imaginary homeland. Imaginary homeland. You imagine what you left, what you had left. And you really, actually, in your displacement and dislocation and in your loneliness and your alienation, you may be nostalgic for India, for the food here. I think I'm a very good cook now. I better be, I have to live in 58 years. If I'm not, I would have had a broken marriage maybe, though he cooks very well, but not enough. I want my own cooking too, my mother's cooking. But it's not just that. It's just you can't recover exactly what you left behind. So everybody teases me and says, Purnima, what do you come back to Ahmedabad for year after year for 58 years? Your mother is gone, your father is gone, the uncles are gone, the aunties are gone, sister is in America, brother is in Phoenix, Arizona. What are you coming here for? It's nostalgia. I can't let go of it, but it's an imaginary homeland. I don't try to analyze what I have lost or what I have gained. But it is very much something different. And I want you to come back to these themes. We are going to see them in literature. 1 second, because it's on the screen there, and my boss here has told me that I need to look at the PowerPoint, which I'm never used to. With my with my students, all the other faculty members, you would use a PowerPoint, and it is a very good aid. I just I wanted to see your expressions. I want to see your faces. I want to see your grim looks when you don't understand, your grimacing, your smiles when you agree with me. So for me, the face-to-face contact is enormously important. But I see Homi Bhabha. It's a name you need to know because Homi Bhabha has written some of the most important theoretical stuff on diaspora, and he he defined for us, you and me, the definition of dislocation, and he associates it with, as the screen behind me I'm sure tells you, or at least the one in front is telling me, it's displacement. And Bhabha uses the term also, which is very interesting to me, a fascinating term, unhomely. In diaspora, when you go to for me, for example, specific example, I go to the US, live there for decades. It's home, but it is unhomely. And I can't even tell you what the difference is, but it's a really big difference. And there's a lot of nostalgia for that. And so please keep that in mind. I'm going to build on that theme later on. Okay, let me move on to some other themes here. Before I move on, let me lighten it up for you. I used to always think, the moment I felt my students found it very heavy, I wanted to lighten it up so that they would walk away from here smiling, that they had not only learned, but they had a good time. And if you don't have a good time, send me a nasty note, okay? I still have some days here. Okay, so I want to read out to you a poem written by an African, actually it's a song, the blues. Some of you might know jazz and blues. And it's from an African, and it sort of touches upon some of the things I'm talking about, some of the things I would like to pick up on during the week. It says, and I quote, "Too foreign for home." Okay? Too foreign for home, too foreign for here. Never enough for both. So here you are. So the poem says, so here you are, me in America, too foreign for home. I've become a foreigner. So now I'm not really properly an Indian. And you'll say, ye to firangi hai, ye foreigner hai. When I'm there, I'm too foreign for the Americans because I'm too Indian. And I live my life between two worlds. And this is what is called a hybrid for identity. It is not a very clear-cut identity. I don't have any sorrows about it. In fact, I've told myself, I'm going to rejoice. I'm going to have the best of two worlds. When I come to India, okay, so I'm a little much of a foreigner for you, but I'm one of you. I want to be a part of one of you. When I go to America and I'm in my classroom with my American students, they think, she's Indian. She speaks with an Indian accent. She sometimes wears Indian clothes. Tough luck. That's the way I am, okay? So I really, it resonates me that, so here you are, too foreign for home, too foreign for here, never enough for both. Okay? I'm not feeling the same kind of despair about it, but there is certainly something there. Okay. Any time, by the way, I don't care who sets the rules here for the next whatever, 30 minutes. I am, or 1.5 if we count the tutorial. I'm the boss here. You can ask me any questions, say, I don't understand, I want clarification on this. That's what I'm here for. That's what I'm paid for. That is my role here. So please don't hesitate to ask. The other thing that I wanted to raise here today as theoretical stuff is much of the early scholarship on diasporic experiences of women, and that's what we are dealing with in this workshop for 5 days, dealt with women as quote unquote victims. Okay, it was always a discussion, scholarly books on women seen as, viewed as, perceived as victims of diaspora. They are finding themselves in a new land, sometimes with a new husband. There's an arranged marriage, a new husband. They are trying to adjust and adapt. But equally, there are all kinds of difficult adjustments. Okay? It's not just a new man you're living with because you're married. It's not just a new country that you have moved to. It's not just missing your parents and your brother and your sister and the food your mother made for you. It's not just the friends you hung around with and gossiped and laughed with abandon and spontaneity. It is much more. Um, but I think it is wrong to think about women only as victims. And it is very true that if you look at the early migrations of women, okay, women going in slavery, being forced into slavery, women from India going to the Caribbeans as indentured labor, and in modern times, I have to say, and I'm going to get into that at some point tomorrow or whenever, Indian women, particularly from the south, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, and Karnataka, mostly, and Tamil Nadu to some extent, but mostly in Kerala, going to the Gulf countries in recent times, okay? Now, they go there. The situation of the Gulf women, the Indian women in Gulf, is particularly worthy of study and scholarship because I think they are victims, okay? And they are victims because the governments in the Emirati states, in Oman, in Dubai, in all the countries of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, have a policy where they put it very politely, guest workers, quote unquote. So if I'm from Kerala and I am poor from the village and need to, for economic reasons, make money to support myself, my family, my children, I get a job. And what are the jobs that they are getting? Most of them go as nannies to rich Arabs and taking care of their children. Now, isn't that something really sad about a woman leaving her 2 or 3 children below the age of maybe 10 or 12 or 15 or whatever, or 5, with her mother or mother-in-law, going to the Gulf countries to work as a nanny or as an ayah or as a domestic servant? As a guest worker, she is not allowed to take her husband and her children. Okay? This is the reality. Now, I see that as a victim. She is not only vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Single women are always, you have to be careful. I'm getting so old that now I think nobody's going to hit on me. But when I was younger, it was scary to travel alone, okay? Because you are vulnerable to strangers who think you are easily there, available, huh? But these women are working day and night in the homes of people. And there's a real, they are victims. How, if you talk about nostalgia, I cannot even begin to think about it. Now, my daughter is in her late 30s. I still miss her. The first email I send is to my daughter and not to my husband because I'm missing my daughter. Now, how much more would that loneliness for her be if I were working The daughter you won't see for 3 years, 4 years until your term of work expires. You can't take holidays, you don't have the money, and you are sending money home to support them, their schooling, their education, their family. But that is victimization. That guest workers are, and after their term of work expires, they have to pack up and go. They can't become naturalized and bring their husbands and their children. What kind of life is that? But it is economic necessity that pushes them. So clearly, and slavery, how much more can we go or talk about when we talk about the victimization of women, African women particularly? 11 to 13 million men and women, half of whom may have been women or a little more than half, transported to the continent of Africa, all of the continent of Africa, East Coast, South Africa, and also the Caribbean countries of the Caribbean, and to Fiji and Mauritius and Virgin Islands and you name it. And these are women who are also, you can see, as victims of diaspora. You are taken in chains, you are vulnerable to sexual abuse by your masters, you have no rights, you cannot, the children born to you or the children you once had, if you had, in some ways you are disconnected from everything. So it is true that early studies on diaspora really dealt with victimhood of women, seeing women as victims. But something has changed since the 1970s. And what has changed since the 1970s is what I am a product of, okay? Nobody forced me, and nobody can force me, okay? I went on my free volition, and I could take or leave or go, and I became, I have to say, a naturalized citizen, a US citizen. When my daughter was born, very reluctantly, in order to give her the security, I became a US citizen. And I struggled and I fought and I argued with my husband, and I said, I don't want to give up my passport. And he persuaded me. He said, you don't have to, but think of it. For her, it is easier. Life is easier. And for me, to jobs, being a US citizen is easier, particularly now, the political environment is such. Hey, I'm thankful I've got a US passport. With the present administration in the US, I don't know, after 58 years, when he would throw me out. He talks about diversity, hating diversity, inclusivity, equity. These are the three terms that I used in my entire teaching career. I wanted a diverse student population. I wanted to bring in Africans and African Americans and Caribbean students and people from other places and other countries. I believe in diversity. I think it enriches the world. But now it's very different. Nobody can touch me, right? In a sense, I am untouchable to that extent. But things have changed. So women, what diaspora can do now for your generation of young people, as it did for me, is to really allow you, and I mean both men and women. I do not want men folk here to think that my entire lecture is dedicated to women, even though I'm slightly partial to women, but I am equally, it is, I feel I want to address the needs of the male students and the female students. And I think that what has changed is that now people who move to different parts of the world, or even from village to town, have new opportunities, new chances of learning new things, of discovering, of self-discovery. And self-discovery is probably more important than any kind of discovery in the world. And a real sense of empowerment. Okay? And I think particularly men have always had an easier time with this. But I think what has really been beneficial for young women who have migrated either from the village to the town or from India to foreign countries, USA, UK, Australia, Canada, whatever, you name it, is that not only does it open up new doors for you, not only does it give you a glimpse of the world outside there that you didn't know when you were in India growing up, because we live in such relatively cloistered lives, secure life, but it allowed you to discover yourself. And that is such, it is sometimes painful journey of self-discovery, but I have, from, if you were to believe me, and I'm only one person, it is so exciting to have a sense of discovery of oneself and one's potential. So what diaspora can do is not just, we need to move away from the victim complex to empowerment, particularly since we are talking in this course on women and diaspora, of how it allows women to be more empowered. So in what way? Okay, certainly when you go to another country, it is sometimes necessary, most of the time it is quite essential, that in order to support your lifestyle with your husband, if you're there with your husband, two people work in order to support yourselves and your children, in order to maintain a certain standard of living, right? It is encouraging of women to get out of the house, no matter from what traditional background you came from, and move out from the domestic into the public realm, okay? From the private to the public, to find a job, to work 5 hours, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And what does it do? Sure, it puts money in your pocket, which is also very empowering, okay? Exceedingly, because I think as long as women are economically dependent on a man, no matter how good, how decent, how generous, how kind that man is, it is doubly empowering to feel that you have all that kindness and generosity, but you have your own power and you have economic power also, because economic power can do wonders. So you are not dependent on anybody. So the new diaspora is a diaspora of opportunities, in many ways, wonderful opportunities. The other is, of course, renegotiation, reworking of gender roles, okay? Now, this is a little bit more difficult, and you'll have to forgive me if somewhere there's somebody here who gets a little offended, but I am who I am, and you have to take me the way on my terms, right? Take it or leave it. So I would prefer you take it, okay? So, but the fact is, what diasporic experience does is, so when I went to the US, I went as a single woman. I did get married in the US, as it happens to an Indian. And I started, once I finished my PhD, he was working on his PhD at MIT in civil engineering. When he finished, he was a little ahead of me because he's a little older than I am. And I went to the US to study, okay, and we'll talk about that. I had a scholarship to Harvard to study Chinese and Japanese history. And I had studied ancient Indian history at Delhi University. And I had been a teacher of history, Indian history at Delhi University. I jumped at the opportunity, though I made a lot of nakhra. So when I got the opportunities, I have to say this because I have to give her credit. I was a student, some of you, if you are students of history, would know this. I was for my MA in history, in ancient Indian history, I was a student of Romila Thapar, who is probably one of the best known historians in India, okay? A woman. So Romila Thapar was my teacher during my years of MA. And I was a good student. I don't want to say I was brilliant. let somebody else say that. I don't know. But anyway, so when I started applying for a PhD program, graduate program in the US, I had no money. I mean, you may think looking at me, she comes from a rich family. No, no. My mother never worked. She was a social worker. And my father worked in the government. He was an engineer. So I had to find a way to support my education. So I went to Romila and I said, I'm applying. And she said, fine. I said, if they ask for letters of recommendation, may I ask you to write, would you be comfortable? She said, Purnima, absolutely. Okay. That's why you need a teacher who is the... So when the letters started coming in, so I applied to 3 or 4 places: London School of Oriental Studies, African and Oriental and African Studies, because it was in, they do work on India and Africa, to Yale University, which has a very good reputation, to Oxford, and to Harvard. Between you and me, and this is a secret that I don't expect you to go and tell Romila Thapar. So between you, so I got back admission in all of them, but I needed money. I was poor. So when they wrote, I wrote back to Yale and I said, thank you, but no thank you. And I wrote to London and I said, thank you, but no thank you. I want to go to the US. I didn't tell my parents, and they never know till now. And then I wrote to, when I got other admissions, I said, I want to go to Harvard. Now, Harvard is considered one of the best universities in the world. But in all honesty, it wasn't Harvard that was attracting me. It was a boy at Harvard, who was not even at Harvard. He was at MIT, and that's my husband now. But I negotiated, and I told them, I said, no, I don't want to go to Yale. I don't want to go to London. I'm deeply interested in programs in Harvard, which was absolute nonsense. I was deeply interested in a young man, and I wanted to find a way to get there without telling my parents, and I wanted money. Anyway, so I landed up in. It's a long story. We'll talk about it later on because I'm embarrassed to give you the details anyway. Anyway, so what it taught me is this ability to negotiate, to renegotiate, okay? Not just with the outside world. When my husband, my present husband, for what? I don't know how many years I've been married. I can't even remember now. It's been so long. 69, I got married. So it's been a long time. I'm very happily, I wish he had come here because he would have told you things from his side, which may not be always what I tell you. Anyway, what I learned was I needed to work. He was a student too. I mean, he just was finishing up his doctoral work in civil engineering. So I wanted to work. At some point, I dropped out also at Harvard. I do things, I guess I'm temperamental because we didn't have money. I didn't want to be worried about it all the time. I started working in a store, and but I learned to negotiate. And then when I got married, with my husband, with whom I have a very good working relationship, I said, I'm not going to sit at home. My dreams are dreams that I have to fulfill. And I didn't come to America just to marry you. I came, yes, you are very important, but I came to fulfill all my dreams. And amongst the most important of those was to get a higher education, was to teach, because there is nothing I like more than being in the classroom. So I said, how are we going to manage? And I said, and very quickly, this man who had never cooked in his own mother's house learned cooking. He's a better cook than I am. So when you come to visit my house in Washington, he will make the biryani, mutton biryani and lamb biryani for you. This is how you are able to empower yourself. Not always. I don't want to give you false hopes. But gradually, when you discover yourself, you also learn the technique of negotiation with the outside world, with a job, also with your own family members, saying, listen, I work 8 hours a day like you do, so why don't we both share everything? And there is a wonderful joy about that. I don't know how I can tell you. You need to hear from him because you're saying, she's lucky she's got a husband who makes biryani for her. But that's not true. I mean, we share, we share. There are things he does, there are things I do. This is learning. This would not have happened had I married in an Indian context. It would have been more difficult. I don't want to say it wouldn't have happened. So you learn to negotiate. And that's the point I was making, the renegotiation that takes place. Um, okay, let's talk a little bit. We have talked a lot about opportunities. Um, there are also differences and challenges, okay? And the real challenge oftentimes is when you have children, okay? Hey, you can manage your husband, you can manage Harvard or whatever it is. Children, they need you. They are innocent, they are newborn. So when my Anuradha was born, and it's a deeply personal. As I said, I have not unraveled this to even my own students in the US because there was never an opportunity. I didn't want to do it. When she was a few months old, my husband and I sat down and I said, I'm not giving up my teaching. I just love my classroom. That's the source of my well-being. What are we going to do? How are we going to manage with a newborn baby? Okay? And am I lucky? My God, I'm damn lucky, but still. And we used to live 42 miles away from my college in Washington, where he had a very, very good job at a research organization in urban planning. And that was his first job. So I tell him, I said, what am I going to do? Who's going to look after the baby? I'm not going to give up my job. I don't want to. I love my job. I love my students. He must have thought it over. The next morning, he gave his resignation at his job. A job he had sought after for so long, which gave very good money. And he said, and I used to drive to Frederick, which was 42 miles to my college, because I liked Washington. I liked cosmopolitan cities. And he said, Purnima, we need to give up this home. If both of us want to do parenting, I will certainly give my job up, which he did, and I will work out of the home. Okay, I'll start a little company out of the home. Nothing compared to what what you get in a research organization. And he said, but we'll have to make the sacrifice of giving up our house, my first house ever of our own. Let's move to Frederick. And I said, oh, Frederick, small town. All my students live there. I'll always be meeting them when I go to the shop, to the store, to the grocery. He said, it doesn't matter. We are bringing up a child and we want to do the best. That way you won't be spending 1 hour going, 1 hour coming. This way you will be there. And it was the best decision we made. But I made him promise. I said, when she reaches high school, 14 years or whatever, I said, let's come back to Washington. I want her to not be in a small environment. I want her to be in a world which is larger than Frederick. I also didn't want to live in my shadow because she too felt shy about having a mother who was a teacher at the college. Everybody knew me. Most of the time she didn't acknowledge that she was my kid, but that's all right. And we moved there, and I could work, and I could teach, and I could be with my daughter. The rest of the time, he was with her. So in the daytime, he was with her as he worked on his at home, from the home job. And they were the happiest years. And she grew up one way or the other. You have to renegotiate these things. What more can there'll be so much opportunity Okay, I was leading up to this, and I go off storytelling is disgusting, but anyway. Um, the real challenge for diasporic parents is also ne- to tensions, possible tension between and the differences between first generation migrants and the second generation, right? So I was a first generation. My daughter growing up in America, even though I dragged her to India every year when I could, because I wanted her to meet both grandparents on both sides and learn the language and whatever, understand Indian culture, nevertheless is an American child. And from the very beginning, I understood that I had to accept that she, as a second generation, would not have the same values, would not have the same ideas, would not have the same dreams as I did. And that it is critical for parents in the diasporic situation to not just hold on to their children and expect them to only be Indians. You've got to have an open mind. It is very good to teach them Indian culture. It is very good to feed them Indian food. It is very good to speak the language at home as we do with Anuradha in Gujarati. But notwithstanding all that, and it's very good to have them connect with the mother country, which is India, which is why so every time I had a sabbatical, you understand a sabbatical in America, if you teach 7 years, you get 1 year off. Every time I got a sabbatical, I would tell my college president, I am going to India and I'm going to teach in a women's college. We'll talk about that later on in one of the other lectures. And I would go to Madurai to teach there. I would go somewhere else to a women's college. I'd take Anuradha with me. My husband might stay back behind, might visit, but Anuradha was going to experience, so that I wanted her to have a wider experience of a wider world. And I have to say that most parents are actually much more comfortable having their children grow up as Indians. So when I'm getting old now, and the other day before coming to um, Aligarh, I was sitting in my, working in my closet, looking at my saris. And I think, oh my God, I have these saris my mother gave me and grandmother gave me, these wonderful silks from South India. Anuradha doesn't wear anything. I can't give her anything. So I tell her, Anu, can I give you these saris? She's an American child. What am I dreaming about? She's going to wear American Indian saris when everybody else is dressed in. And I think I have to accept the saris can go into whatever, in a museum, whatever, disintegrate. Uh, Anuradha ain't going to wear the saris. And okay, so first and second generation dreaming is very different. And I sometimes am troubled that Indians tend to cling. It's very good to keep your culture. I do, language, bringing her here, exposing her to Indian culture. But to expect that she will marry an Indian man, even though secretly I wouldn't mind, but to expect her to do that, to expect her to wear Indian clothes, half the time I don't wear Indian clothes. It's come to Washington in winter time when it's snowing and wear your lovely silks. And within days you will realize it's not convenient. It's not comfortable. Also, you get noticed. You want to fit in, not stand out in another culture. So I have no problems. You know, when I was coming here, I asked Professor Sadaf, uh, Dr. Sadaf, I said, what am I going to wear? Um, and she said, kuch bhi pehno, farak nahi padta. And, you know, that's fine. But I have to respect the culture in which I'm there. But I'm delighted to see that most young people are dressed the way I would dress in the US but don't have the courage to dress in your environment, because मैंने सोची ये they'll never invite me again. They'll say ये तो बिल्कुल American बन गई है, उसमें कुछ Indian ही नहीं है. So anyway, first, second generation, totally different dreams, totally different ideas, totally different aspirations. And diasporic people have to learn to live with that. Okay, I've got a few minutes left before we go on uh, to talk, and I don't know. Okay, so let me familiar with some terms that somebody or the other is going to bring. Culture shock, a word that you are going to use in diasporic literature, scholarship, studies of diasporic people. Culture shock. It is the shock. It is the despair. It is the fear. It is the alienation that you feel when you first find yourself in a new culture. You don't speak the language properly. You have an accent. I still don't speak American English properly. It was culture shock initially. My clothes, the first time I went, the first year in Massachusetts at Harvard, I'd go about in wintertime in a sari. And I realized how stupid. It's so cold. I'll get pneumonia before I get something else. You got to change. And that's culture shock. You have to adapt to that. The other, accepting the ways of life of other people. Food. Today we had wonderful lunch. Some of you were there, joined. Now, surprising it may seem, I am by preference a vegetarian. I eat everything, but I'm a vegetarian. But by golly, it was a culture shock in America for me to first go to people's homes. And I would see a steak there, still pink and bleeding. Or maybe the stomach would churn from the inside, and I didn't know what I would do, how to not be rude, but also not feel that I was throw up in somebody's house. Because I'm a good Guju from Gujarat, from a vegetarian background initially, not so now. So I think the culture shock comes in many different ways. The weather can be very difficult. I love the winter, not your Aligarh summer, not my horrible summer of Ahmedabad. No, next time they're going to have to call me to Aligarh in the winter time. Otherwise, Butt is not coming. Okay? It's too hot, too humid, too much rain, too much humidity. That's a culture shock. I like the winter. I've got used to the winter. And I grew up in Delhi. So in some ways, winter was what I loved. So the culture shock comes in many ways. Um, so what diasporic people do is occupy a third space. You are neither an Indian nor an American. You are a nowhere person. Huh? Is it lonely? Sometimes. But it's also extremely empowering. If you were to ask me, and sometimes I'm a little reluctant to say this, there is not one thing I regret, either about going away or coming back so often. I have two homes. I'm not fully belonging to any, but I like to believe that I find joy and meaning and happiness and satisfaction in both my home country, which is India, and my host country, which is United States. And I guess that's the way I'm going to be always. So I've taken up exactly, Dr. Farid will be so happy that she is so punctual. 3 to 4, exactly 1 hour. Uh, Now, I don't know, are these poor things having to listen to me yet another hour? Or can they have some tea or water or go something? I don't know. My bosses will tell me. What I would like to do in the tutorial, and I'm going to make it very informal, okay? I'm hoping that I can ask questions, but I don't want to. Huh? I want you to comment on something I may have said, or something you are thinking about, or questions you have of me, and let us have an open, free discussion. Don't hesitate. I'm not here to judge you. Be thankful. I'm not grading anyone. I'm just happy to be with you. You know, it's been many years. For me, classroom was the greatest joy, other than my family. I loved being with students. That's when I feel intellectually vibrant and alive. And I have to say, I miss the classroom. I occasionally do lectures. I mostly work on writing. But there's a loneliness about not being, not sharing face-to-face interaction with students. It's you who give me energy. It's you who make me feel I've got to do a better job. Because it is important that when you walk away from here, I want you to say, well, I learned something, okay? That at least there are some thoughts that came up, some that are going to enable me to think further about diaspora. And if you do that, I will feel fully fulfilled that my visit all the way from the US to be with you is completely worth it. It's well rewarded. Thank you very much. बोलो ठीक है Okay. That's okay. I have my audience. Do I care? Allow them. अभी 4 बजे. अभी 4 बजे. What do you want me to do? Have the tutorial? Huh? ठीक है? They don't want to. Okay. My boss here says that we can move into the tutorial. I just tease, doctor. Of course, I'm just teasing. They understand that this woman, not her, is crazy. So please forgive. Yes. Please speak up, Spash. Maybe वहाँ ज़्यादा हवा आ रही होगी पंखे की. It's so hot here. Especially नहीं तो मैं 4-5 बजे पी. नहीं, not only for me. जब तुम पियोगे तो मैं पीऊँ. जब ये पिएगे तो मैं पीऊँ. हाँ. I'm happy to drink, but alone not because I'm not there. Please, if you want, feel free, comfortable. Nobody is going to be a judge. Your mother can.
Ma'am, as you told us about your daughter.
Are you hearing a thing called here? No. Okay. I can repeat it otherwise.
Okay, as you told us about your daughter, that you were looking in your wardrobe and you found new saris like the old one your mother gave, and you said that daughter won't wear it. But there's kind of a human tendency. Hello. I'll just speak on it. Yeah. Yeah, but there's a human tendency of, giving the lineage to your daughter or your children. And sari is kind of an empowerment for an Indian woman, the sari and the bindi that you wear. How are you able to be okay and modern about it? Because it's very difficult as a parent to do that. So I just wanted to know that.
Okay, you heard the question because it is a reference. Whatever pasti after 15 years and get torn, as to how I feel. I have to honestly say that I don't feel any pain about that, because a long time ago I accepted that if I bring up a child in America, if she goes to American schools, she has American friends mostly, then she is an American. Okay, no matter how hard I tried to bring her to India, to put her in a Tamil school. So when I went to Madurai to teach, she was 4 years old. So I bring Anuradha, my husband's working in the US. I have a small flat that they gave me because I was there for the whole semester teaching in Madurai at a women's college. And Anu, and I put her in the nearest Tamil school, okay? All Tamil. This is a girl who only knows English and a little bit of Gujarati that she speaks. And the first dish, and I had a lady who used to come and cook. The college, women's college provided that, who would cook for my family, just so that when I came back from work, there would be food. And she would walk Anu to the school, and it was all. The first day Anu came back from school, she said, "Mama, I'm not going there." I said, "What happened today? I thought you would love a new school." She said, "They all speak something, and I don't know what they are saying, and I can't talk to them." I said, "Anu, you are in the school not because you have to learn Tamil. You are in a school to make good friends. And that is a heart-to-heart thing. It won't matter that you can't speak Tamil." And she stayed, she survived, she endured. Jaise taise, whatever, I don't know. I learned to love South Indian food. At least that was one very positive thing. And still thinks of Madurai with great, great emotion. My feeling is, to be honest, that I have accepted that if you bring up a child in another country, no matter how you feel about your country, you better be prepared to let go. Okay? And she's never really gone. You know, I'm very close to her. But in the ways that, luckily, both her daddy and mummy cooked a lot. We had no choice. When we were hungry, we had to cook. So she grew up in a family with both parents cooking and eating and enjoying food. And we'll talk about food in diaspora experiences in one of the lectures. Food is a very important part of the diasporic experience. It's also very important in recreating memories of the homeland. And Anu now, even though her boyfriends are often American, and they're not choice, I mean, I wouldn't go seek them out, but I don't throw them out either. I accept, ठीक है, जो if रानी को पसंद तो राजा तो ठीक है. I accept it, but the saris are, I tried to alter it a little bit. The sari business really bothered me because there's my mother in them. There is my grandmother in them, and I'm very nostalgic and about my parents, my mother particularly, and she used to travel all over India and pick up the choicest. अब कोई पहनने वाला ही नहीं है, मैं तो जाती नहीं हूँ. And I asked Anu, I said, मैं dress बना दूँ. I'll give it to a tailor, तुम मुझे माप दो, मैं dress. Even that, no, it's too different. I mean, jeans and blue jeans and top. And then I tell myself, what does it matter? If I wanted to bring up an Indian child, we should have stayed in India. And that is very clear to me. And that is a choice people need to make when they leave. You can't recreate home. It can only be an imaginary home. It can never be the real thing. I have no pain about it. Okay, none whatsoever. What I really am happy that while my parents were alive, while my in-laws were alive, she came all the time. And she had a wonderful time here. They indulged her, they taught her, they played with her, they made her laugh. What does it matter? This is another time for her. And she's an American kid. She looks very Indian, but everything else is American. I was doing a stint of teaching. I used to do, even when I was actively working, a scholar in residence. So one semester I went to California to a women's college. It shows my heart is always with women's college. So I went and did a scholar in residence program. And Anu, that year, her poor luck is such, she applied to a lot of places for admission. She just finished her high school. And of all things, she got money, and money is a scholarship to the college that I finally ended up spending the semester. So when I told her, I said, Anu, do you realize it's an accident? I didn't plan it. But that you've got a scholarship at a place where I'm going as a scholar in residence. I had an apartment. Nobody on campus knew that she was my daughter. She wouldn't let anybody know. Her identity had to be clear of her mother, who was a professor. And occasionally when Anu would get hungry for Indian food, she would call up and say, Mama, will you make some food? I had that facility. She said, I'm coming, but quickly, I'm coming. She'd eat, run. Nobody knew that I was her mother. She's establishing her identity, and I was not a very important, or she's trying to learn to detach herself from me. It's absolutely okay, but we are very close now. We are friends. But it's not easy. Any other questions I can answer? Yes, please. Okay, the question is, let me make sure I have the question right, please correct me, that when one migrates to another country, you are there, you are neither there nor here, or in both places, a third person in a hybrid identity. What was the... Oh, how did empowerment? I think the empowerment comes from two or three things. One is, of course, I'll have to be a little political about this. India is particularly, I'm trying to find the proper word. We are not yet, when it comes to women's equality in marriage with a man, we are not yet where we should be. It is still, without any doubt, a patriarchal society, okay? A male-dominant society. Now, there may be pockets there may be individual families where the father is very liberated, the in-laws are very open, but by and large, Indian society is still entrenched in patriarchy, okay? Where empowerment comes from is the American society, where women are very free. They are free to work. They are free in terms of control, not only over their purse, money, but over their bodies also. Okay? They are as free to some extent as the men are. Now, we are not passing judgment. Is it good or bad? I don't know. That's an individual, personal thing. But certainly seeing other people around. And then the dress, how dress can be empowering also. Much as I love saris, I can't wait always to get into blue jeans when I get home, okay? Because I'm free. It's not an encumbrance, it's not falling off my shoulder, and it's not making me feel hot. So empowerment comes out of economic independence. And it comes out of seeing a different set of gender roles, different type of patriarchy. It's not to suggest that American society is free of male dominance. It certainly is not. But to the extent compared to India, we are really way, it saddens me, because I always think, and that's why, people say, why are you always talking about women's college? Why shouldn't I talk about women's college? There's enough going on for men here. They don't need me. In a women's college, I feel I'm not there to teach history only. I'm there to share very slyly, very secretly, very quietly. I want to somehow open up possibilities for women, because I think the world of women, I think all that is waiting is to open up, to give an opening to their potentials. The possibilities, the potential, the promise that women have. which often go unfulfilled. I feel deeply sad when Indian girls in America are at home and they say, you know, my identity comes from being mother and wife. I'm a mother and wife. I'm very proud of that. I'm very happy. But my identity is not a singular thing. You can't just say, I'm a mother and wife, therefore I'm done. I've done my world. If you have dreams, if you want to be something, if you want to become something, then you have to feel empowered. And so that's what the foreign country did. Now I truly believe that had I been in India and never stepped out of this country, now it's hypothetical, it can't happen, I can't go back. I think that I would have, if I would have married, I would have probably married a man very similar to the one I am married to right now, except that they are harder to find here. Okay? I went to Delhi University. I had a lot of good friends. I love them. I'm still friends with them. I visit them. My husband and I go. Marriage? Oh, Toba, no way. I think that within marriage the patriarchy would have surfaced. For me it was not good. Because I wanted to dream dreams and I wanted nobody and nothing to stop me. Okay? I'm not saying one is better than the other. Individuals have to decide for themselves. I don't at all feel that I have my only brother who is also in America, elder brother, 2.5 years older, went to study first, and he met and fell in love with a Japanese girl. And I have a younger sister who is married to an Indian from UP. And she is more traditional than an Indian woman. Okay? And I have to be very careful not to be judgmental, because people decide what they want. Okay? If he's happy, she's happy, why am I trying to liberate both of them? And to what extent? I mean, who am I to decide? I can only decide for myself. Right? But it's not an easy path to tread, every person. And so the women, and there are a lot of happy young women who get married or in marriage go abroad and really discover themselves, feel empowered. So the experiences are different, but it's more difficult. Okay? Empowerment, the environment helps, but also, and we'll talk about that in much greater detail, your background, your parents, your class, your caste, your education, where you are going, all of those are going to make a difference. So never have I felt that any achievement of mine is mine alone. I feel there are multiple factors that entered into it. I can only say, whatever happened, I'm happy where I am. It's a good place to be, and I have no regrets. Any other question? Okay? Don't feel I'm not an expert. I'm just a teacher only. So don't hesitate. We have a lot of time. Any other questions from either from what I said or what you are thinking in your mind? There is no question that is a stupid question. The only stupid thing in the world is not to ask when you have some concern, some issue in your mind. And I'm a student, I learn from you, as you learn, I hope, from me. So feel free to ask a question. Yes, please. Mike, there's one here.
Good evening. Good evening, ma'am.
It's not working now, maybe. Others can hear you?
Hello. No? It is working. Okay. Now it's working. Okay, so ma'am, I have this question. When you mentioned the name of your daughter, Anuradha, which is obviously a very Indian name, so I was very curious to ask, like, when you were naming her, what were the exact thoughts in your mind, like you and your husband? And whatever I know so far about the American culture and the Indian students studying abroad, they usually give themselves another name there, just to not feel awkward or odd about it. So has it ever happened to her, or did she ever felt like odd in that classroom where there were very American students and calling her Anuradha?
Okay, it's a very good question because, and I have to once again, by the end of the evening, I think you'll know everything about me and my background because I've said something, you've asked me something. Yes, when she was going to be born, my husband and I discussed this, and both of us agreed on the name Anuradha. Okay. Now, there are many good reasons. One, of course, is a lovely Indian name. The other is I have to do a disclaimer. I am not religious in the sense of being Hindu religion or any one religion, but I am a student of ancient Indian culture. So Radha is, Radha as personality is very appealing. It's a very complex one. So I wanted, and we agreed on Anuradha. I knew for sure that this name would create problems, family problem. Because as she started getting older, she said, Mama, nobody understands my name. Why did you give me this name? And I said, Anuradha, don't worry. All you have to do is to patiently either tell them what your name is, explain to them what a lovely name it is, what it means, or I don't care, abbreviate. So of course she quickly found a shortcut, called herself Anu. I still use word Anuradha in her passport, Anuradha. Officially she is Anuradha. I'm not changing, but I don't even mind. And the same experience I have with my name, my first name is Purnima, okay, which means the full moon. I was born on a full moon night, and I'm very happy with my name. Okay, my husband's called Kiran. Very easy, so they call him sometimes Karen because there are girls who are Karen, Karen. It doesn't matter. When I first started out teaching, my students would say, "Ma'am, Dr. Pat, what's your name?" And I'd say, "It's Purnima, and it means this, and it's a lovely name." And I said, "Call me by that name." Nobody could pronounce it. Nobody understood it. I said, I don't care. I'm not going to change mine. Okay? To hell with people who don't know my name, so theek hai. But Purnima will remain Purnima. 60% of, I have to say, Indians in America take on an abbreviated short new name. The men as well as women. So, Jaideep hai, agar naam. So they like to call themselves Jai. Raj kuch ho, whatever. Raj. Women will do that. Or they'll pick out names that are really short and specific and easy. I don't feel the name. I'm there to educate Americans. Okay? I feel perfectly content for them to mangle my name a little bit, but I don't mind. It is not, I'm not about to. And the same happened when I went to get my passport. I got married in America. Very simple. We had no money. He was a student, I was a student. And we don't, in my background, yet another revelation, unraveling of my personal life. We had decided that we would have a court wedding. I didn't. So my mother-in-law to be had given me a sari when I was leaving India and a white sari with a little gold and red. So I wore that sari. We went to court. 5 people at the wedding. My brother flew down from Phoenix, and the Justice of Peace, we didn't really have money, but I didn't want also big halaban. So the Justice of Peace, who's presiding over doing the ceremony, 2-minute ceremony, before he does that, he said, now I request the bride to take out the wedding ring and put it on the bridegroom's finger. Toba, oh my God, I said. So I turned around, he was an American Justice of Peace. I said, this bride doesn't have a ring. So then he turned to my poor husband. He said, now will the bridegroom put the ring on the fingers of the bride? The bridegroom is looking around, he doesn't know what to do. He said, I don't have a ring either. All these years, 58 years of married life, I have never worn a ring. My life goes on. We had, it was so funny. It is very unconventional. I come from an unconventional background. It was a good friend, an Indian friend of ours from mostly my present husband's, because they knew him before I reached Boston, gave a party at his house for very close friends of ours. And he and everybody else did one dish. Okay, no catering, no money spent. सबने कोई चावल बनाए, कोई दाल बनाए, कोई रायता बनाए, कोई whatever dessert. And he didn't even make it to my wedding because he said I said, what happened, Shashi? तुम आई नहीं तो you are our best friend, Kiran's and mine. He said, क्या करूं, apartment साफ कर रहा. See, this is the diaspora where he's busy cleaning an apartment because there's a little party for his friends. And it was a joyous occasion. We had no place. I mean, we didn't go on a honeymoon. I don't, again, unconventional. So my husband used to have a one-room place because he had been in Boston for some time. So I said, okay, I'll stay the night there. मेरा पूरा भाई, बड़ा भाई, he started sort of getting very nervous. He started agitating. He said, I think now that the wedding is over, let me go and go to a hotel. And Kiran said, come on, Ajay, what's the point? हम लोग एक पलंग है. There was only one single bed. We will not two, forget three people would sleep there. There was only one room. Said we'll sleep horizontal, like this, सीधा करके, 3 लोग. That was my wedding night. So it in many ways I walked away from, and yet the 58 years have been filled with happiness. It's like a journey together. It's like one helping the other. And our values, and that's the important thing. Always I say, it doesn't matter if it's an arranged marriage, it doesn't matter if it's love marriage. The word love, anyway, there's a lot of love in an arranged marriage also, and can be. But values have to be sort of similar, right? You have to think alike and have similar dreams, or allow the other person to fulfill their dreams. And it's a lot of, it doesn't come easy. There are sometimes arguments, there are sometimes fights, but there's always understanding. And there's always, at the end of it, I always tell him, I said, I'll come back in my next life and you'll be my husband. We'll be married. So it's okay, but I think that I don't want to always speak for diasporic women because I think I'm out of the box here. And I recognize that. Not because my parents were, but so it is. And my brother, who is not married to an Indian, has a Japanese wife, actually has a very traditional wife. And I have to be very careful with my big tongue. Kuch bol na do, kuch kharab na lag jaye. Because she has different values. And if they are happy, I'm happy. I don't have to live with them. He doesn't have to live with. So the world is full of, people with different values, different ideas. And I don't think one is better than the other. For me, I'm happy with what I have. Does that answer your question? Okay. Anu is okay. Someday I hope she comes to Aligarh. I hope he comes, she comes. It was a very rushed decision on my part. Yeah. Okay, say that again. Do you want to come here? And so others can hear you. American, in the teaching. Okay, very interesting. Yeah, I think I did experience some culture shock in my teaching. In some ways I was protected because the subjects I was teaching and I were such that oftentimes the American faculty knew nothing about what I was doing. So I was trained in Chinese and Japanese history and Chinese language, which I don't now remember at all. So I was hard, but my PhD ultimately was in African history and African culture. So right after my marriage, newly married, left my poor husband behind. I got Ford Foundation grant or something, and I took off and went to Africa to do my field work, and came back and finished up the doctorate. Now, I was to some extent protected because the subjects I was teaching were not, it was not like I was teaching traditional subjects. I'm teaching things that are a little outside the scope of a small college. I taught African history, I taught ancient Indian history, I taught Japanese and Chinese history, and then later on I developed a whole series. I wanted to teach women's studies, so I taught a comparative course on women across cultures. I don't think I felt in the classroom, yeah, maybe my accent was a little Indian, but other than that, nobody denied me any opportunities for growth because I was a foreigner. Now, was it because it was a different time? I finished my doctorate in 1976 and got a job immediately in an American environment. Never did I feel, and I was at that point, the only faculty member who was a foreigner. Okay, since then there are many, but only non-American faculty member. I don't think there was any problem. They saw me as a little bit of, they didn't quite know who I was. They didn't know how to place me. I was an enigma. I was strange. But other than that, they were very friendly and very nice. I think the Americans have also broadened their horizons. I don't think you should worry, even as a student. And in my research work, I published several books and articles. In the books, I make no effort to try to adapt myself to American publishers. Okay? And I have never had any major problem of either the use of words or the way I express myself. Very few changes in all the books from the things I have written. Maybe I have learned a little bit of American, Indian American English, whatever that is. I don't know. You know, it's a very interesting question, and I wish I have to give it some thought and reflect on it as to whether I had a hard time when I was teaching or when I was working on books or writing, whether being an Indian was an obstacle to upward mobility or achievement or realizing and fulfilling my dreams. I don't think so. There's a lot of openness and made it much easier because my subjects were so different for them. African, how many of them know about Africa? You know, they only know about slaves who came to the US or went to the Caribbean. It was a whole new thing for them. That they even introduced African history in a college environment, it really surprised me. And having courses on women, I insisted, and I said, not just women will teach it, it will be team taught, it will be interdisciplinary, and I want the head of the religion and philosophy department, who was an older man, and the head of the art department, who was an art historian, an American, both of them, and three of us teaching a course on women across various cultures of the world. And it was such pleasure, because not only were my students every day learning in the classroom, three of us were learning from each other. You know, students sometimes forget that faculty also need to learn. that we too are students, actually. We're just a little ahead of you, but we are students. And the experience was, I was a young faculty member starting out. The head of the religion and philosophy department, an American, was a senior professor. I was an assistant professor. He was a white man, and we were teaching courses jointly all the time in the classroom on women in different cultures. And it was a wonderful experience. He, my friend in the art department, and myself. So students were able to see how faculty discuss things amongst themselves. Okay? How they argue, how they disagree, how they learn from each other. Sometimes students forget that we are also students. And that's why I always felt that a more interactive. You see that I don't carry notes with me. I do my homework at home, and then I want to be eye to eye, face to face. I want to learn from you. I want to see what your expressions are, whether you are going off to sleep. If so, how can I wake you up with something exciting? I think we are learning all the time from our students. And I absolutely have to say that there is nothing that I studied. I used to work in the Library of Congress. I published books. I wrote papers. I did conferences. Nothing that I learned from more than my students in the classroom. It was always the thing that really enriched me. They may not ask all the questions, but they don't even realize that I was learning alongside with them. And it was such a happy experience. That's why when Dr. Farid asked me, I couldn't say no. I told my husband, I said, heat. I was in India in April on a private visit, my usual, with my husband. And so I returned in April. So I've been gone just a short time. And I said, but the temptation to come back and be once again in an environment with students, with young people, with minds that are still fresh and ready to absorb. It's for me, that's well worth everything. All the travels and all the whatever, lack of sleep or something. I'm very, very honored to be here. Thank you. Okay, what can I do now? Any other questions?
We'll move forward with the tea and then we have to do that.
Okay, let's do that. It's tea time for me, and I hope something for you too. Okay? Thank you again very much for making my trip. Aligarh will... Okay. Thank you. I hope someday I bring my husband. He's the better half. He really is. So I hope someday he can see this environment, which has made me very happy. Okay, thank you. चले? Are you ready? बहुत ज़्यादा बोल दिया.
Please move forward for the tea, everyone.
Okay.
ये वाला mic.
Okay, we will have Professor Pandey's lectures just after the tea break. So